It was an ordinary evening in the city, where the neon signs' light softly reflected off the wet sidewalks, and people hurried home after a long workday. The store was filled with the whispers of customers and the ringing of bells on the door, signaling new arrivals. Sylvester Stallone stood in line, preparing to buy a luxurious gift for his wife. He looked calm in his usual stylish suit, not aiming to attract unnecessary attention. His movements were relaxed but attentive. Suddenly, the store doors swung open with a loud chime, and a young blonde woman appeared in the doorway. Her presence immediately drew the attention of everyone around her. She was dressed in expensive, fashionable attire that clearly screamed her status. She walked into the store looking like the embodiment of luxury, proud, stubborn, with an expression that seemed to say, "This is my place." However, when her gaze fell on Sylvester, she squinted slightly, sizing him up in a way that didn't seem right, but still continued walking. It seemed as though she didn't notice anyone else until she stopped right in front of him. At first, she slightly raised an eyebrow, evaluating him. Then, with an expression that left little room for doubt, she spoke. "You're the one standing here," she said with a slight, audacious laugh. "Oh, I don't know. This place is clearly not for people like you." Sylvester looked at her with surprise, but didn't lose his composure. "Excuse me, I'm not sure I understand what you mean," he replied, trying to keep his tone calm. "I mean, this is a store for people who understand quality, and you look like you stumbled in here by accident." Her voice was sharp and self-satisfied. She looked him up and down again, as if assessing whether he deserved to be in the same room as someone like her. Sylvester held her gaze for a second, slightly tilting his head, but his face showed neither outrage nor anger. His response was clear and restrained. "You seem very confident in yourself. That might be interesting, but perhaps you don't know who I am." The blonde woman seemed to intensify her disdain. She shrugged and grinned. "Oh, I know enough. Your turn is waiting for you where the rest of people like you are. You probably need to go back to where your style is more fitting. This is not a place for old folks, is it?" Sylvester silently looked at her again. His face remained impassive, though inside, thoughts began to form about how he could have acted differently. The store grew silent, and everyone around seemed to have stopped, watching the scene. The blonde woman seemed sure she had won this small battle, not knowing she had just triggered the other side of this conflict. Sylvester gathered himself, deciding not to give her the last word. But as he turned to leave, he couldn't forget what had just happened. His thoughts were no longer as calm. He exited the store, his gaze unwavering, though a certain irony began to grow in his heart. This was not the end. Sylvester stepped out of the store, closing the door behind him. A biting wind hit his face, and he paused for a moment, inhaling the cold air coming from the city streets. He was calm, but still felt the unpleasant residue from the encounter with the blonde woman. His mind was already racing, considering what might have happened if he had responded to her differently. But perhaps it was better to ignore her words. However, as soon as he neared his car, he saw her, the same blonde, who had walked out just minutes after him. She commanded her high heels to strike the sidewalk, her nails digging into her purse as she walked. As soon as she saw Sylvester, she gave him a quick glance, then, without hesitation, directed her gaze toward his car. "What a lovely car you have." Her voice carried a rough but cold irony. "Though I'm sure it's not even worth your attention." She stopped by the car and lifted her skirt, casting her eyes toward yet another important detail, the tire. Sylvester, watching her from a distance, felt the situation was only escalating. Whatever it was, he no longer wanted to let it go. He stood, observing her as she suddenly tilted her head back and continued her unpleasant comments, increasingly provoking him. And in the next moment, when she bent down to her car to pull the keys from her bag, he couldn't hold back his reaction. He approached her tire and quickly, without hesitation, struck it. Sylvester relished the sound that echoed from the rubber, signaling the irreparable. The tire was deflating. The blonde was returning to her car when she suddenly heard the sound. Her face changed, and all her proud gestures evaporated. "What are you doing?" she shouted, glaring at him with outrage. "Are you crazy?" Sylvester simply shrugged, smiling nonchalantly. His response, as always, was cold and composed. "I just thought you'd feel the difference. Maybe now you'll understand what it's like to be let down." She was silent, staring at him with hatred, her face flushed with anger. She took a few helpless steps toward the tire, trying to figure out what had happened and why her car was now irreparably damaged. Sylvester slowly walked away, his footsteps echoing down the street, and as always, he left behind a quiet resonance of his actions. Of course, he wouldn't have been this harsh with other people. But sometimes, certain actions demand a response. By the time he disappeared from sight, the blonde remained standing next to her car, trying to come to terms with what had just happened. There was a lot of anger in her eyes, but she also realized that she could no longer control the situation. Her attempts to assert her superiority had failed. The blonde stood by her car, almost hypnotized, unable to believe what had just happened. She walked around the wheel, trying to understand what was wrong with it. However, the deflation was undeniable. Her tire no longer looked the same as before. Her hands began to tremble in anger. "This can't be true," she muttered under her breath, trying to collect herself. Left without any help, she pulled out her phone and called her friend. As soon as she got through, she practically screamed, "You won't believe what just happened. Someone just punctured my tire. It was Sylvester. Oh my God, what do I do now?" There was no response on the other end. He was obviously trying to figure out what had happened. But she felt her anger reigniting. She was certain she wouldn't let this slide. After a few minutes of trying to figure things out, she let out a bitter sigh and put her phone back in her bag. She decided not to wait for help. This incident was becoming her personal battle. And even if it took a few more hours to fix it, she would find a way to get back at him. Meanwhile, Sylvester was already walking down the street, having forgotten all about the incident. He felt no remorse, but knew that this scene would be just another stage in the game. For him, it was just an interaction between two people who had come to a point of conflict, and he felt he had emerged victorious. It was more than just a physical act of revenge. It was a response to her aggression and impudence. At that moment, Sylvester hadn't expected her revenge to be so quick. He got back to his car, and when he sat behind the wheel, he saw something unusual. A tiny scratch had appeared on the windshield, which looked like a small message. He leaned closer and saw the word written in red marker, "See you." Sylvester smiled, not believing his eyes. Now, he realized this wasn't over. The blonde had decided not to give up so easily. She had already found a way to respond to his actions. At the same time, the blonde, sitting in her car, began to ask herself how far she was willing to go to settle this conflict. Her thoughts were revolving around revenge, plans to turn the situation in her favor. She didn't like the idea of leaving this unanswered. This was just the beginning. The blonde sat in her car, not taking her eyes off the writing on the windshield. There was a fire in her eyes that couldn't be extinguished. She couldn't just leave it like this. The more she thought about the incident, the more her anger grew. "He didn't just offend me, he humiliated me," she thought. "And he thinks I'll let him win?" She clenched her fists, her heart racing with indignation. She was ready to take the next step, but this time, she would play by her own rules. Meanwhile, Sylvester continued driving home, feeling as if the whole incident was behind him. However, something in his heart whispered that he hadn't quite closed this matter. And if the girl decided to make another move, he would be ready for it. When he got home, he lay on the couch, contemplating his decision. He was calm, but at the same time, His mind was racing with thoughts of how this conflict might develop further. He knew that nothing had happened without a reason, and all he had done was simply respond to her impertinence. The blonde, meanwhile, wasn't sitting idle. She had decided to act. Her next move was much more serious than just getting back at him for the tire. She picked up the phone and dialed one of her mechanic friends. "Hi, I need some work done on my car," she asked, keeping her voice calm. "Of course, no problem." "What happened?" the mechanic replied. "There's a problem with the tire. It needs to be replaced. And one more thing. I want you to install a stand for the tire that went flat. Let's just say a little change that will make the car a bit less convenient for driving," she added with a cold smile on her lips. The mechanic on the other end paused but agreed. "Got it. As you say," he replied, understanding that she wasn't joking. Satisfied with her plan, the blonde hung up the phone and headed towards the auto service, planning her next big confrontation. She already knew what she would do when she met Sylvester again. She was ready to go all the way to regain control of the situation. At that moment, Sylvester, arriving home, received a message from a friend who had heard about what happened at the store. It was a short message. "You won't believe what she's doing. She's decided to fix the issue with the tire, but her plans won't stop there. She just contacted a mechanic. She wants to get back at you, leaving no chance." Sylvester laughed, realizing that he shouldn't underestimate his opponent. He understood well that this wasn't the end, and that with this woman, he was in a game that had just begun. Now, everything depended on who would make the next move. The next morning, Sylvester woke up and immediately felt that today would be different. Something in the air told him that the conflict with the blonde wasn't over yet. Last night's events left him thinking that she probably wasn't going to back down so easily. He decided not to rush, but also not to let the situation slip out of his hands. This was a game, and he knew that in order to win, he needed to be ready for anything. After breakfast, Sylvester headed to his garage, trying to focus on something that had nothing to do with that unpleasant woman. But his mind wouldn't settle. He couldn't forget how she had mockingly laughed at his attempts to justify himself at the store. She was too stubborn and clearly had no intention of giving up. Meanwhile, the blonde was already at the auto repair shop. She sat in a chair watching the mechanic work on her tire. She could see his hands skillfully handling the tools, but her mind was elsewhere. She was planning a big move. Everything she had done so far was just a small part of what she could actually do. Her gaze was sharp, and she was ready to take it all to the next level. When she left the shop, the mechanic called her. "Your car is ready, but maybe you should go check it out outside. I heard you'll find a nice surprise waiting for you." She raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What surprise?" she asked. "Better check it out," the mechanic replied with a mysterious tone. "I think it will be interesting." The blonde quickly got into her car and drove to the spot where her car was parked. She knew that Sylvester wouldn't back down so easily, so she prepared herself for another round of this game. As soon as she drove off the parking lot, a sly smile appeared on her face. She was ready to give him a lesson he wouldn't forget soon. Sylvester, unaware that the blonde had just left the shop, stopped at a traffic light when his gaze fell on something familiar. His eyes couldn't be deceived. On the other side of the road stood her car, with a large flat tire. He couldn't believe his eyes. "It's her, she did it," he thought. He pulled out his phone and dialed the mechanic's number. "I know what happened." "Did you really break her car?" he asked, trying to hide his surprise. The mechanic laughed on the other end of the line. "It wasn't me, my friend. She did it all herself to avoid looking like a victim. She knows how to play her game." Sylvester realized that the game had reached a new level. Now he would have to respond to this challenge. But one thing was for sure. He had no intention of losing to this woman. They could go back and forth for a long time, but he knew that in his hands was the final card that could stop this endless cycle of revenge. He set off to meet her. Sylvester drove through the city, his heart beating faster with each passing moment. He already knew this was the final battle. The blonde was certainly no typical opponent. She was cunning and had no intention of backing down. But he wasn't ready to let her win. He had one last trick up his sleeve to finish this. He pulled up to her car, which was parked on the side of the road, as she tried to change the tire. She hadn't even noticed him approaching. He stopped next to her, got out of his car, and walked over. "What's going on? Trouble with the tire?" Sylvester asked, trying to stay as calm as possible. The blonde looked up, her eyes sparkling with anger. "Oh, it's you," she replied, smirking mockingly. "You look like you're about to tell me how to fix this again." "Well, it seems you've already tried to fix it yourself," he said, glancing at the flat tire. "But sometimes it's better not to play with fire." She turned to face him, ready to reply, but her words faded when Sylvester slyly shrugged. "I'm giving you one chance," he added, "to stop this game before it spirals out of control." The blonde seethed with rage, but she knew this wasn't just an empty challenge. She sighed and put the tools in her trunk. "Great. If you want to be wise, just leave, Sylvester." And then he made the final move. He smiled, got into his car, and quickly drove off. But before disappearing from her sight, he casually twisted her tire a little more, ensuring she would be stuck for even longer. And so, in the game where each tried to break the other, Sylvester emerged victorious. She was left with her flat tire, and he, heading home, smiled. This was the end of their games. The winner was determined not by words, but by the quiet, yet effective move. Sylvester returned to his car, feeling a calmness that only comes when you know you've done what needed to be done. His car started moving, and he began driving through the streets of the city. He didn't feel joy or anger, just a neutral satisfaction from knowing the conflict was behind him. But a few blocks later, he saw her car again. The blonde was standing beside her vehicle on the side of the road, trying to change the tire, which had been punctured once more. She looked up when she saw him, and there was no outrage or anger on her face. Just a brief glance that seemed to say, "You won, but this isn't over." Sylvester stopped in front of her and felt how all the arguments that had risen between them now seemed much smaller. Now he knew what mattered more, not fighting for the last word, but the ability to maintain self-control. Sometimes the battle for your place in life isn't about winning each individual moment, but about facing each challenge calmly, knowing that you are you, regardless of how others perceive you. He didn't say anything. He simply nodded and drove away. There was no anger in his heart, and he knew it was the right thing to do. He left her on the road to change,